Hello, all of my history-loving friends. This is Madam Morbid. I am your guide on any number of historical adventures. And today we're in Tupelo, Mississippi at the tiny, tiny home where Elvis Presley was born in 1935. What they have here is a circle of life all around the house with every year of Elvis's life, beginning in 1935 and ending in 1977. So I just went through the museum. I wasn't allowed to take pictures in there, but they have some of Elvis's clothing, lots of pictures of his family. They had a lot of the souvenirs that you could buy, you know, those things that Tom Parker came up to sell to the public, the Elvis hat, the medallions, the keychains, you could get Elvis dog tags from when he was in the Army. Gladys Love Smith and Vernon Presley lived in this neighborhood and attended this very church that now stands near the home Vernon built right after they got married. They only dated for 2 months after they met. Gladys was 21 and Vernon was 17. Many of their dates took place at the nearby skating rink. Now, skating rink can be a risky choice for a date. And I'm going to interject a little personal story here, but my mom and dad's first date was at a skating rink. It was my dad's idea, and my mother had never skated once in her entire life. And she said my dad spent the whole night picking her up off the floor as she was black and blue the next day. So I couldn't help but chuckle when I read that all of their dates were at the skating rink. But I'm guessing that was probably just about the only thing to do in the area, and they were both probably pretty good skaters. And on June 17th, 1933, they eloped. They were so poor, they had to borrow the $3 to get their marriage license. Vernon worked for a man named Orville Bean. He loaned Vernon the money he needed to build this 2-room shotgun house on Bean's property. Vernon built it with his father and his brother, and they built it next door to Vernon's parents on Old Saltillo Road in East Tupelo. Now, East Tupelo was a completely different town from Tupelo. For that reason, none of the services that people who lived in Tupelo were available to people in East Tupelo. There were no playgrounds for the children. It was considered the wrong side of the tracks. The poorest of the poor lived in East Tupelo. While this house was on a street that was wired for electricity, the Presleys could not afford it. There was an outhouse in the back, and they used oil lamps for lighting. The fireplace in this bedroom area is original. The wood-burning stove in the kitchen is also original. It was not only used to heat the house, but it was also used for cooking. The icebox in this room is also original. It is the only piece of furniture that still exists that was in this house and owned by the Presley family. Gladys became pregnant and had a very miserable pregnancy. Her ankles got really swollen and they were covered with these purple patches. She had to quit her job at the Tupelo Garment Center. She probably had what we today call preeclampsia, which is very, very high blood pressure in a pregnant woman that can cause damage to internal organs. It can even cause seizures and coma, and often leads to death of the pregnant person or the baby. Elvis was born in this room at 4:30 in the morning on January 8th, 1935. Gladys had a really hard time. And it's an absolute miracle that she and Elvis did not die. At first, her mother-in-law, Minnie Mae, and a midwife named Edna Martin Robinson attended to her. During the delivery, Gladys was in agony. And finally, they had to pull Vernon aside and say, if she does not see an actual doctor, she's going to die. Hoping to save Gladys's life, Vernon went and got Dr. Robert Hunt. At 4 a.m., Elvis's twin, Jessie Guerin, was born. The doctor handed him to Minnie Mae. She looked at the boy. He was gray, and he was silent. She said to the doctor, he's not breathing. The doctor took the baby, took a few minutes and tried to revive him, but failed. Elvis came 30 minutes later at 4:30 a.m. After the birth, Gladys was in a bad way, and she and Elvis were taken to the Tupelo Hospital's charity ward, where they each recovered for 3 weeks. The cost of birthing Elvis was $15. Vernon and Gladys could not pay it, so friends and family and their church family all got together and raised the $15 to give to Mr. Hunt for the birth of Elvis. It was custom back then to have the middle names of twins rhyme. Elvis was named for his father's middle name was Elvis, and his middle name, Aaron, was named for a friend of his father's, Aaron Kennedy. Jesse was the first name of Vernon's father. They buried little Jesse in Priceville Cemetery. They dressed him in a little blue outfit and buried him in a shoebox because they could not afford a casket. And Elvis visited the unmarked grave of his dead twin often. Gladys believed very strongly that when one twin died, the one that lived got all the strength of both. Whatever went wrong during the delivery, Gladys was never able to have any more children. After losing a child and not being able to have more, Elvis became very precious to Gladys. She worried about him a lot. She was very protective of him. But at the same time, she let him go and play when he wanted to, as long as he stayed in school. In 1936, Tupelo was hit by a devastating F5 tornado. It stands as the number 4 deadliest in history. During the tornado, Vernon and Gladys cuddled little Elvis as they hid underneath their bed. They could hear debris hitting the house and the sound of crumbling brick outside. It was the sound of St. Mark's Methodist Church being blown to smithereens. The tornado only lasted for 5 minutes, from 9:04 to 9:09. When it was all over, they came out. The house still stood, but from the house, down the hill, they could see the ruins of the Methodist Church. And Gladys couldn't get it out of her head how close the tornado had come to taking them as well. The men went into Tupelo with hammers, saws, picks, and hoes to help rescue people. People were trapped in burning buildings. If anybody in Tupelo was able-bodied, they were part of the recovery team. We can only imagine what horrors those rescue teams saw. Winds exceeded 300 miles per hour. Officially, it killed 216 Tupelo residents. However, Black people living in Tupelo were not counted. So who knows how many people actually died in this tornado? Elvis's family were terrified of storms after this happened. And Elvis's cousin, Billy, said they actually had a storm shelter. And anytime the weather was bad, Gladys and Vernon and Elvis would come and take shelter in theirs. It's October 1937, and the Presley family is really struggling financially. Vernon makes a very bad decision. Trying to keep their head above water, Vernon sells a hog to Orville Bean. Maybe Vernon didn't think he got a fair price for it. Orville wrote him a $4 check, and a very angry Vernon got together with Gladys's brother Travis Smith and another friend named Luther Gable. These other men may have felt like they had been wronged by Orville Bean in the past, so they all got together and decided to take this $4 check and forge it for a more fair price. The exact amount they forged the check for is not known. It's not in the indictment. It's probably anywhere from $14 to $40. Of course they got caught very quickly, and Orville Bean was enraged and decided to throw the book at all three of them. Gladys is desperate. She goes to Bean in person and she pleads with him, please, our little boy is so little. Vernon didn't know what he was doing and he was just trying to keep us afloat, and it did no good. Vernon's father, Jesse, does not lift a finger to help his son Vernon at all. As a matter of fact, Jesse bails out Travis, Gladys's brother, while leaving Vernon in jail. Why? One theory is that maybe the hog Vernon sold was Jesse's. And instead of pressing charges for theft against his own son, he just decided to leave him for 6 months in jail while waiting for trial. It sounds like Jesse was just a really mean man. He had kicked Vernon out when he was 15 years old. Not only did he stay in jail for 6 months when Jesse had the money to bail him out, but he also didn't lift a finger to help Gladys. And then later on, Jesse abandons Vernon's mother, Minnie Mae, and when divorce papers are filed, he tries to claim Minnie Mae abandoned him because she wouldn't come and quote-unquote join him wherever he had gone. For a long time, Orville seemed like he just went out of his way to make Vernon's life harder. He ended up kicking Gladys and little Elvis out of the home because Vernon had not repaid the $180 he loaned him to build the house. But a few months later, Orville will actually be instrumental in helping get Vernon released early. Vernon was sentenced to 3 years in Parchman Prison. Ultimately, he served 8 months. After that 8 months, Orville wrote a letter to the governor pleading Vernon's case, that his family needed him, that they were in dire straits without him, and that he had never done anything wrong before. He didn't expect him to ever do anything wrong again. And this letter was effective. He wasn't the only one to write the letter, but because the charges had come from him, his opinion carried more weight, I'm sure. That time in prison was so long for Gladys. She went to work for a laundry. They were having to go and live with family and move frequently. And it was a 5-hour bus ride to visit him at Parchman Prison and a 5-hour bus ride home, so 10 hours round trip. Little Elvis didn't understand why his daddy was gone, and he was very upset, and he cried a lot. This picture, it's one of my favorite of tiny Elvis, but you can see by the look on Gladys and Vernon's face, the stress they are under. This is around the time he goes to prison. And it's possible this was even taken at the prison. One of the reasons Elvis has that cute little look on his face is that he had a peanut in his mouth. Now, Elvis loved peanuts. But finally, after 8 months, Vernon got back home. Because kids didn't have much, a lot of kids who lived in neighborhoods like Elvis's learned how to build things. Elvis was no exception. His cousin Billy Presley talks about a swing he made one time from an apple crate. They just used whatever they could find lying around to make toys and things to play with. If you can't afford to buy things, well, you gotta make it yourself. He liked to do things like play marbles, go fishing, read comic books. Captain Marvel was a favorite. He was a shy, crippled newsboy who would transform into Captain Marvel, and it's thought that perhaps his love of Captain Marvel might have influenced some of his style, the cape, and the lightning bolt in the TCB logo. One of the favorite things the family did was listen to the radio. They liked to gather around. They would listen to the Grand Ole Opry, Red Foley, Minnie Pearl would have them laughing. They would listen to the Carter family. A local star was a hillbilly known as Mississippi Slim. He was an absolute favorite of Elvis's. His real name was Carville Lee Osborne. Eventually, Mississippi Slim would accompany Elvis in his very first radio performance on a show called WELO Saturday Afternoon Amateur Show, Jamboree. And a lot of the influence Elvis had was of the blues that he was hearing in the African American community, as well as the gospel he heard at church. The church was very important to their family. They continued to go to that same little church where Vernon and Gladys had met. This Assemblies of God church was the center of the Presley family's social life. Elvis learned to play the guitar here from Reverend Frank Smith. He said, quote, "I played guitar and taught several boys, including Elvis, to play. I showed him a few chords to get him started. After his family moved into town, I walked from East Tupelo to North Green Street to help him play. At that young age, neither his voice nor his playing was particularly outstanding, but he was always interested and always polite. Later, he used a book to teach himself to play." End quote. Music was a huge part of the way they worshiped in this church. The whole congregation sang hymns. Reverend Frank would play his guitar during every worship service. Quartets would come and sing, and initially, being part of a gospel quartet is really what Elvis wanted to do when he got old enough to work in music. That isn't what ended up happening for him, but gospel music was always extremely important to Elvis because he had been so exposed to it as a child. In researching this, I was shocked to learn that in his legendary career, Elvis only won 3 Grammy Awards, and every single one of them was for gospel music. The first time Elvis ever sang in front of people happened right in this room, standing by this very pulpit. He was 6 years old. He walked up to the front of the room, and he turned and he faced the congregation. Gladys and Vernon were both standing proudly behind him as he began to sing, "Jesus Loves Me." "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so." Everyone in the room was talking about how cute he was. Oh, what a little singing angel. That's so adorable. And absolutely none of them had any idea where life would take this adorable 6-year-old singing "Jesus Loves Me" in front of them. I took quite a look around this pulpit, knowing that this is literally the pulpit Elvis stood beside when he was singing this song for the first time in front of anybody. In 1946, when Elvis turned 11, one of their neighbors accidentally destroyed his wagon. He gave the family the cost of replacing the wagon, and Elvis decided rather than buy another wagon, he wanted to use the money to get something else. So Gladys took him to the Tupelo hardware store. He wandered over to the section on rifles. And Gladys, being the protective mother she was thinking, heck no rifle for my beautiful baby boy. And as mothers are able to do, she managed to manipulate him enough to get him away from the rifles and over to the section with the guitars. Now, I don't know if they had more than one guitar or if it was just a single guitar on sale, but she managed to get him over. The clerk's name was Forrest Bobo, and he worked at this hardware store for decades. He showed Elvis the guitar. Elvis stood there and strummed it a little bit and finally decided, yes, this is what I want. The guitar cost $7.75. As they were getting ready to leave the store, Forrest Bobo looked at Elvis and said, "Now you take that home and you learn how to play that. You might be famous someday." Elvis fell in love with this guitar and soon began taking it to school every single day, which was unusual. Around this time, Elvis was going to Milam Junior High, and bringing his guitar to school, as well as his poverty, made him a target for bullying. Milam was one of those schools where there were rich kids and there were really poor kids without much in between. And of course, the rich kids liked to pick on the poor kids. If you look at this class photo here, you can't see it, but Elvis is the only child in this photograph not wearing shoes. At schools he had gone to previously, that would not have made him stand out. But at Milam, it did. The guitar was also looked down on. Elvis was considered hicky. The guitar was used to play hillbilly music. And the fact that Elvis would bring it and he would play it sometimes in homeroom made him a target. It's interesting to look at how Elvis was remembered by friends, schoolmates, neighbors, and teachers. He didn't get in trouble very often. Here are a couple of incidents that people remember when Elvis flirted with breaking the rules. Fellow student Becky Martin said one of the things Elvis used to do, her brothers would go play with Elvis down by the bridge. They would go swimming in the creek. They had slipped off. And she said, occasionally my mother would send me to go get them and bring them home. She said, well, my brothers got whoopings. I don't know what Elvis's parents did to him for punishment. Of Elvis's talent, Becky said, quote, Elvis was just a kid like the rest of us. We know he could sing some, but some of us could too. Who could have imagined where his music would take him? End quote. Elvis's friend Jimmy Galt only remembered one time when Elvis really got into trouble. The outfit Elvis always wore was overalls and different shirts. One of his classmates noticed how ratty Elvis's clothes looked because his father worked either in a clothing store or was a tailor. This boy went up to Elvis and said, hey, my dad could get you some new shirts. You want me to bring you some? Now, when I initially read this story, I assumed the boy in this story was trying to be nice. But knowing that he was bullied here, I imagine the tone of that changing. There's, hey, your clothes look pretty worn out. I can bring you some more. My dad can get you new shirts. Then there's, hey, your clothes are worn out. You know, my dad could get you some new shirts. And maybe it's more likely Elvis got angry because it was said in a mocking manner and the fact that that boy could get any clothes he wanted while Elvis couldn't. And this made Elvis so angry. And Elvis went after the boy, jumped right on him and attacked him. They were pulled apart, and as far as I know, neither got into any trouble. But it just tells you about the kind of pride that Elvis had. Jimmy must have been really good friends with Elvis because he had some really great stories about Elvis. He used to spend the night at Elvis's house a lot. Jimmy says he used to ride his bike over on Church Street to Elvis's house. He would play with Elvis and he would spend the night. He said sometimes they would stay up telling each other ghost stories. And he said we just scared ourselves out of our mind. He remembers that Gladys used to tell them, now you boys don't stay up too late. And he joked, quote, she need not have worried because we were too scared to stay awake after they'd gone to sleep, unquote. He said sometimes after this they would get up early and they would accompany Mr. Presley on his trucking route. And he said one time they were unloading at a grocery store in Palmetto. Jimmy said, quote, I pitched a box of cartridges to Elvis. He looked terrified and screamed because he was afraid it might blow up, end quote. Vernon had a big laugh about that. And Jimmy says, quote, as far as I ever knew, Elvis couldn't read music, but he was a natural musician. He had that talent and ability long before he came to Milam. Elvis's talent really started to show in school, and it was his teachers who first noticed how gifted this young man was. The guitar was not necessarily looked at all that positively. Like I said, Elvis was bullied. He was treated like a hillbilly. He was made fun of the kinds of songs he liked to sing. But Mrs. Camp, their homeroom teacher, really encouraged Elvis to keep going with his playing. Fellow homeroom student Lando Lee said, quote, who can say what effect she had on that poor, shy boy when she asked him to stand in front of our class and sing, end quote. A lot of those Fridays, Elvis and other students would break out into jam sessions, basically. Sometimes Elvis would sing by himself. Sometimes he would sing songs in a group with other students. Roland Tyndall, a school friend at Milam, said, quote, Elvis would pick his guitar and sing and tell us one day he was going to be on the Grand Ole Opry. We were all very doubtful of that, but we didn't say anything to him about it. One of the first teachers to notice Elvis's talent was his 5th grade teacher named Oleta Grimes. Mrs. Grimes just happened to be the daughter of Orville Bean. One day, in her class, Elvis got up and sang the Red Foley song, Old Shep. I looked this song up. It's a very sad song about a boy and his dog, and The dog is old Shep, and the boy falls in the river, and the dog saves his life from drowning. And then he stays being the best dog in the whole wide world. Then he gets old, and then he dies. This song had the chord progression D, A, and E. Those are the chords Reverend Smith had taught him. So that was a song he could easily play and sing. Mrs. Grimes was so impressed. She went to the principal and she said, "This Presley boy is really talented. We need to enter him into the state children's talent contest." So together, that's what they did. They entered Elvis. It's October 3rd, 1945. This is the first public performance Elvis Presley ever does outside of church. And he showed up to the contest in his overalls, in his country shirt, circular wire-rimmed glasses. Elvis was so short he had to stand on a chair to get to the microphone. And he sang Old Shep, he sang it a cappella, and won 5th place. I do believe my favorite little Elvis story involves he had a friend in band, and this friend took Elvis to the band instructor, and Elvis said, "Sir, I'd like to be in the band." And the band director said, "Okay, son, what would you like to play?" And Elvis said, "Well, I want to play the guitar." And the band director paused and looked at him and said, "Well, son, you can't march with a guitar." So I guess we're talking about marching band here. And at that point, Elvis decided, "Oh, well, I'll just stick to guitar if you don't mind." The Presley family moved frequently while living in Tupelo. Until 1946, they lived on Berry Street. When they could no longer make the payments on that house, they moved into Tupelo proper, living on Commerce Street for a while. Then they moved to a little shack on Mulberry Alley, just across from what was basically the black neighborhood known as Shake Rag. Elvis really came into contact with the black culture, their music, their tent revivals, their juke joints, their cafes and churches, and certainly that had a big impact on his musical style later on, which is what made his music so unique when he first came on the scene. You just didn't see that black influence in other white artists, and it made him stand out. The family's time in Tupelo came to an end in 1948. They'd been talking about moving to Memphis for quite some time. There just weren't many opportunities for the family in Tupelo, and they thought they might have a better shot at a more stable life in Memphis. In November of 1948, they sold all of their furniture, loaded up what they were keeping, and drove to Memphis. I'm going to make a trip to Memphis at some point, and we'll continue this story about what his life was like in Memphis. But basically, when they got there, they were accepted into a federal housing project known as Lauderdale Courts. It had started in 1938, and for the first time, they had their own home. It had 2 bedrooms, they had a modern kitchen, they had their own bathroom, which was very alien to their family. Elvis became friends with other kids who could play music. He really started to develop his talent and his own style. He made his first recording at Memphis Recording Service in the summer of 1953. He sang the 2 songs, My Happiness and That's When the Heartaches Begin. It cost him $3.95. And Marianne Keisker, who did the recording for Elvis, made a note on Elvis's file that said, "Good ballad singer, hold." And it was in July of 1954 that Elvis was invited to audition at Memphis Recording Service. And that's when Mr. Phillips saw him for himself. It's when Elvis started to sing a 1940s blues hit called That's All Right that Sam Phillips really saw the potential in this kid. He thought he'd found something special, and that was the beginning of one of the most amazing music careers in history. And it all started right here in Tupelo. A poor kid with no shoes, wearing overalls, could not even read music, but would grow up to change the music industry forever and to change the style of music that Americans were listening to. 11 years after that contest at the county fair, Elvis came back to the Mississippi-Alabama Fair and Dairy Show. But this time, he was absolutely the most famous up-and-coming artist of the era. Tupelo dressed every store window with Elvis themes. There was a massive banner that said, "Tupelo welcomes Elvis Presley home." Elvis was presented with a guitar-shaped key to the city by Tupelo's mayor. It was only 8 years after Vernon and Gladys had slipped out in the middle of the night, penniless and homeless, to leave for Memphis. Elvis opened with Heartbreak Hotel, and the crowd of 5,000 did what pretty much every crowd did: scream their head off. Complete pandemonium, teenage girls losing their minds over Tupelo's own Elvis. And literally the police and National Guard had to struggle to maintain order. And what Elvis did was all the money that was made from that performance, he took that money and he bought all of that property where the house he was born in stood. And he wanted it built into a park for the kids of that neighborhood to have somewhere to play, which he did not have as a child growing up. And it became a community center. Eventually, the house was opened as a museum, but it didn't really take off until after Elvis died in 1977. It had kind of fallen into disrepair. Vernon came back and he did a walkthrough of the house, and he showed them how they had it laid out in 1935, where the furniture was. They gradually purchased furniture from that era for the house. Vernon had the icebox. I'm not sure how they held on to it or why, but he had it and he gave it to them. And after Elvis died, that's when they built this chapel. All of his fans raised the funds to build this memorial chapel for Elvis on the grounds. It opened a few years after Elvis died. And when you go in there now, and this is open to the public, you don't have to pay a fee to enter the chapel. And they play Elvis's gospel music 24/7 in this chapel. His story is that quintessential American dream, rags to riches tale. It is an actual example of the American dream actually happening. And it hardly ever does. But Elvis's story is one of them. And it wasn't that he had this just amazing talent. It was that, yes, he had the talent, but he also had something completely unique, his own style that nobody else had. And that's what made him stand out. The very thing that kids made fun of him for in junior high is what allowed him to become an absolute American music legend. Before I close out today, I want to tell you a little bit about this statue. It's called Becoming. The little boy in the front, which is, of course, childhood Elvis, is actual size. There are holes in his socks to show his poverty, and it represents the beginning of his life. The entertainer behind him is a representation of Elvis in his Aloha in Hawaii concert. It is larger than life, and it is in the pose that Elvis took at the very end of the concert, basically showing the end of Elvis's life, from the beginning to the end. The impoverished boy who became the legend. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you liked this video, please hit the subscribe button. Please hit the thumbs up for me. It helps in the algorithm. Share this with all of your Elvis-loving friends. I can be found on patreon.com/MadamMorbid. You can always send a super thanks as like a tip. And I have merch now with these great images of I stalk dead people, because that's what historians do, my friend. It's a great conversation starter and helps spread the word about my channel too. If you can't help financially though, just keep watching. If you keep watching, I'll keep making them because I like doing it. Sorry this took so long. I got pretty sick, lost my voice for nearly a full 2 weeks. It was crazy. Plus I had my trip to Florida. So I apologize. I have been AWOL for a while, but hopefully I will stay healthy and that won't happen again. I'll see you guys next time.